Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dickinson High School Communication Arts YouTube channel. Today we're going to be covering an introduction onto congressional debate. So what is congressional debate? Well, simply put, congressional debate is a mock legislative debate style wherein you have students who are going to make bills, laws, or even constitutional amendments. They're going to submit them, we debate them, and we have a good time. To get a really good example of all the things that you can have in terms of having a good speech style, we're going to now look at a quick YouTube video on how that works.
Speakers, please rise. Senator Ancheta, and is that pronunciation correct?
It's actually Ancheta, sir.
Senator Ancheta, please correct me on any pronunciation mistakes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Senator Jason Ancheta, representing the state of Texas. For the convenience of the judges in the back, it's spelled Ancheta. Again, it's spelled Ancheta. And then please just give me a thumbs up when you're ready for me to begin speaking. All right, this side is good. Awesome. This side is good. Awesome. And then Mr. Chair and Parliamentarian. Awesome. All right. Colleagues, you guys good? Senators, looking out across every single person who's sitting in the seats of this Congress, I see not just a Congress, but the next installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In fact, as we start looking out, I realize that it's not just Thanos that can snap his fingers and make his problems disappear. It's this Congress. That's why, as we start looking towards today's legislation, number F4, to end corruption in the Northern Triangle, what we find is that we should be passing today's legislation. So please stand with me and support today's legislation. But we stand in support of today's legislation for a couple of reasons. First among those being the fact that when you start looking towards the current situation, we're trying to alleviate a lot of human rights abuses that we find in the status quo. But then second, what we also need to remember is that in addition to this, we need to try and make sure that we're promoting a government that can solve these issues on their own. It's with these two issues in mind that we stand in support of today's legislation on the affirmation. So first, when we start looking towards the problem as it exists right now, we refer to Médecins Sans Frontières, aka Doctors Without Borders, in their report entitled Forced to Flee Central America's Northern Triangle, a Neglected Humanitarian Crisis. This is a report that they published in May of 2017, which specifically outlines that an estimated 500,000 people cross into Mexico every single year from El Salvador, Honduras, as well as Guatemala. And we find that for the millions of people from the NTCA region, we find trauma, fear, as well as horrific violence. And these are dominant facets of everyday life. So it's not just something that ends when they do reach Mexico. In fact, the report furthers when they tell us that the migration route makes refugees prey to a couple of things, among those being criminal organizations, and sometimes with the tacit approval or complicity of national authorities, as well as the fact that they're subject to violence and abuses like abduction, theft, as well as extortion, torture, and rape. So as we find it right now in the situation that we're trying to deal with, obviously there's a lot of human rights abuses going on. But it doesn't just stop there, because this time we refer to an article from Mr. Jim Patterson with Research News at Vanderbilt University. He tells us on October 3rd of 2017 that when we start looking at the concerns about crime, more than 65% of parents within the area of the Northern Triangle have prevented their children from playing outside, as well as being unsupervised during the past year. But then furthermore, this is extended when we look towards the Latin America Public Opinion Project survey from September of 2017, when they tell us that citizens stay home at night and avoid public transport because they're afraid of being crime victims. People shouldn't live in fear like this. That's why this United States Congress uses this piece of legislation to, like we stated earlier, snap our fingers to hopefully try and alleviate the issue. But it doesn't just stop there. The second reason why you pass today's legislation is because when we start looking towards Mr. Douglas Farah, he tells us that the state with shrinking resources and hollowed out structures is in retreat. So by passing today's legislation, this Congress stands in support of the change that we want to see. So stand with me in support.
Thank you, Speaker. 3 minutes, 10 seconds. Questioners, please rise. McFeely, Shaw, Dwar, Jacobson.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
So ultimately, why is it that you believe that this legislation, which specifically targets high levels of corruption in the higher echelons of these governments, is going to be more effective than in developing infrastructure in these areas?
So right now, what we're finding with these governments is the fact that they just can't deal with the problem. So because of that, the specific target of this legislation is looking at those actors. Now, I know where you're coming from, but in the long run, I'm hoping that by passing today's legislation, it gives us that infrastructure and sets the precedent that we can see to help build
How does this
infrastructure in the
legislation
future.
provide infrastructure rather than just targeting corruption?
Senator Shaw.
Hi, Senator. So let's discuss the specifics of the piece of legislation as an affirmation speaker. Now, let's first discuss about subsection A. So within that, it says that it's going to target local jurisdictions. So why is that
Yes.
effective?
So local jurisdictions have proven to be more effective
What's
than
an
the national
example?
government. What was
What's
it?
an example of that?
So an example is when we find that, like these NGOs
In a
working with
country.
local, when we specifically look at that report, they tell us that specifically looking at El Salvador, when Doctors Without Borders works with a local provision,
How is that similar to something I've seen in
Senator Dwar.
Okay, so where's most of the corruption inside Central American countries centered right now?
central government.
Okay, so knowing that, and if those governments are corrupt, how can local governments have any power standing up to them?
Because the local governments are the ones within their jurisdictions making a difference in the
Okay,
community.
but if the central government is just going to shut down their power, again, how do they have jurisdiction?
But the cool thing about that is that we have associations like Doctors Without Borders that give them more of a presence in the communities as opposed to the central government.
So how well has that been working right now?
Senator Jacobson.
Hi, good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
So, you talk a lot about the grievances under the current conditions in the Northern Triangle. I'm just wondering what today's legislation actually does.
So it gives us the support that we need within the region
How?
to set up that infrastructure because it shows us that on the international stage we're going to make a difference.
Okay,
it doesn't
so-
necessarily have to be like a specific
Okay,
action,
can I
but it's
mention
the
something?
Yeah, sure.
Right, so in Section 1A, it mentions the Kingpin Narcotic Act in addition to the Magnitsky International Act. So what do those specifically do, and who are the known violators?
It
Thank
just
you,
shows that
Speaker.
We'll target it.
The Speaker may be seated.
I thank the chair.
Okay, in this video, it's clear to see that Senator Anchetta has a very good job of not only introducing his legislation topic and covering all of the stuff that he needs to cover. He restates his thesis, he speaks very clearly and eloquently, and he does a very good job of keeping you engaged in all the things, as well as answering questions very appropriately. But now we're going to cover some debate terminology. So, legislation. Legislation is a specific written proposal, bill, or resolution made by a member or a committee. And in North Dakota, we do not necessarily have committees anymore as it was gotten rid of in 2018. We do still, however, have a student committee wherein you submit legislation to your coach and they will submit it to other coaches to verify. So there are three types of legislation that you can debate. There is a bill, which is a very specific legal framework. It's going to be your law, everything that has to do with it, and how it's going to be accomplished. And then you're going to have your resolution, which is just your congressional assembly taking on a very specific stance on a topic. So it might be, this Congress feels we need to express the sense of the Navy needs to rebuild itself. That would be a resolution. Whereas the United States Congress would like to rebuild the Navy using these methods. That would be legislation. The third and the rarest type that you will probably never see is what's called a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment is where you take a constitution and you want to amend it or add an amendment or change an amendment. And those are very rare. You typically don't see those too often. Some other important terminology to know is agenda. So agenda is the order of legislation suggested by the committee member or the assembly as to how you're going to debate it. So when you get into the room, you will have an agenda that will be set. You also have the presiding officer. Your presiding officer is going to be the leader of the chamber. They're also sometimes referred to the chair. The correct way to address a presiding officer is Mr. Presiding Officer, Madam Presiding Officer. The presiding officer is based on the pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of the United States. The next thing you need to know is amendment intent, which is a specific change to an item of legislation, planning exactly which words it modifies and not changing the intent of the legislation, which is called the gamut. If you have a bill, you can't just say, well, we choose to not do this. You cannot change the intent of the bill. You can, however, change some of the finer execution of the bill. We also have authorship speech, which is the first speech on a topic, which is going to be 3 minutes long with a mandatory 2-minute questioning period. Your authorship speech is going to be to whoever school or person wrote the legislation currently being debated. So if you have multiple members of that school in the room, you'll just have to decide beforehand who is going to give the authorship speech to decide who's going to get that first speech. The authorship speech is the only speech that does not follow the rules of having residency, which gets into my next part, which is what's called precedence. Precedence is the standard rule in most congressional debate leagues where who they pick to speak is going to be directly based off of who has spoken last. So if Representative Anchetta has spoken before Representative Domine, then what will happen is that Representative Anchetta will have higher presidency and therefore be able to speak before Representative Domine if they both stand at the same time. So the next one is what's called geography. Although it's not as common, it's often used to balance out the speaking order. Basically, it's going to be if Anchetta is on this side of the room and Domine is on this side of the room, you pick one and then the other and back to this side and back to this side, which balances out the amount of speaking order, especially considering most schools can have different seating orders, or different leagues can have different seating orders for how the kids are separated. The last one is what's called activity. Activity is a way of picking people based off of who has given the most or least questions or who has given the most or least speeches. Now, all of these three can be used, and it is actually the discretion of the presiding officer of which speech will be, or which method will be used to select the people. That being said, it is also the ability of the presiding officer to get in trouble for this if they pick a very biased way of doing it. If they're doing only geography and they're only just randomly picking people, that's not a good idea. If they're doing only recency and not looking at how many people have given speeches, again, that can be very poor. So it's all about maintaining that balance. Hello everyone, we're going to talk about the competition in chronological order now. So first is legislation. So legislation is when the participating schools submit their legislation. In North Dakota, the schools at the end of the previous season submit their legislation proposals, and then a committee picks all of the legislation for all of the events the entire year. Now, some other districts have what's called committees, wherein you have schools that at the meet will pick the legislation for the next meet. You also have what are called extemp meets, which are also very rare, where you have people pick the legislation the day of the meet. But basically, what we're going to have is picking that legislation and then having that legislation provided on a docket. Now, the docket is the entire group of the legislation that you're going to be debating on. In North Dakota, you can get your docket by going to ndhsaa.com under the Fine Arts tab, Student Congress tab, and that should be on the very bottom of the corner of the screen. You can download the docket. And if you can't find it that way, you can also find it on the NSDA website. There will also be links to it there. So once you get your docket, you're going to have to research it. Now, many of these topics you may know superficially, but the only way to win congressional debate is to have a very good, keen understanding of the topics being discussed. So you need to have a lot of research, a lot of information. It's good to print out things like I do and put them in files. Other people have a tendency to just put them on their computer and have them on access in offline mode, because some tournaments do require you to turn off your Wi-Fi, so you cannot rely on Wi-Fi to have your information and other information. The next part is going to be speech writing and role playing. So speech writing is obviously going to be pre-writing a few of your speeches. It's good to have a couple speeches up your back sleeve, a couple cards that you can refer to as you're using and debating, so you can have that bit of jumping off point to when you're giving your speeches. If you do not have this role-playing ability, if you don't role play, which is also another important aspect of writing a speech, it's basically going, okay, I'm a U.S. Senator, and how am I going to represent my constituents? So you have to have that ability to think about how am I a senator and how am I going to make things better for the people that voted for me. And that's just a good way to get your head in the game on how to write and debate speeches. So the next thing you're going to be looking at is chamber opening business. That's when you finally get into the room and you're getting ready to debate, and you're gonna have the time of your life, I promise. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna go into the chamber, you're going to get your name placard, which will have your name on it. So Senator Hamburger, Representative Hamburger, or insert your last name here. And you're gonna find where you sit at, you're gonna sit down. And then either you'll probably have what's called a temporary presiding officer and the chair, or your parliamentarian, which is colloquially referred to as the chair together. Now they're going to, first off, this might vary from district to district, but in North Dakota, they're first going to set the agenda, which is going to be what debates you're going to have in what order. The next thing they're going to do is they're going to pick the presiding officer. And the presiding officer elections are a very interesting way. So basically how they're going to work for each session is you're just going to take a fragment of paper, you're going to pass it along and vote. And there can be up to as many as every person in the chamber running. There's no limits on how many presiding officers you can have. So the time on the presiding officer elections greatly depends on how many people are running. You may have meets where only 1 or 2 people are running, and it's instantaneous, it's quick as can be. You have one vote and the whole thing's over. Now your new presiding officer is then going to pick, the people to start running the debate. So immediately when the presiding officer is going to get there, the first order on the business is to cover the first piece of legislation on the docket, on the agenda that you set. Then you're going to go through it, first affirmative speech, first negative speech. So the first affirmative speech is going to be what's called your authorship speech. Now that is entitled to 2 minutes of questioning period. So you'll have your 3 minutes of time to speak on the subject. You will then have 2 minutes of time for any of the competitors in the room to ask you questions about your speech for clarification purposes, for anything like that. Now, in North Dakota, you're not allowed to ask follow-up questions unless the rules have been specifically suspended to allow for follow-up questions to be asked. So if you have suspended or amended the rules, then what you'll have is you can ask follow-up questions, you can ask for clarification when you're asking questions. Now, the presiding officer, depending on who is your presiding officer, might allow a follow-up question, but it's typically not good to ask because it can lower your score overall in participation of the room. So how this is going to now work is you're going to go through all your topics and debate them as you go along. There are 3 categories of speeches you're going to be giving. Your first kind of speech is what's going to be called an introduction speech. That's going to be your first 5 to 10 speeches. That's going to be introducing new topics, new ideas, new themes, a bunch of stuff that's going to set the debate for the rest of the day. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be introducing many of the information that you found while researching the docket. You're going to be introducing some themes, possibly some specific ethical, logical, or patho-emotional arguments that you'll have. And you're going to be using those and going on to the second category of speech, which is going to be your intermediate speeches, which are going to be a mix between your introductory speeches and your last kind of speeches, which are going to be your crystallization speeches. Your crystallization speeches should never introduce new information, but it can introduce new points and ideas about information that you already have. So you're going to be able to use it to have more information, to crystallize information you already have, to go back and say, well, they made these arguments, but they contradict them. It's basically going to be the wrapping up of the debate before a committee member will ask to previous question. They will motion to previous question, which will then bring that bill up for a vote. So first, they'll vote if they want to actually vote on the bill, and then if they do decide to vote on the bill, then they will actually vote on the bill. There's a lot of voting in student Congress. So after they vote on the bill, then it's closed, case closed, unless it gets put on the table, at which point it is put on the table and will get brought back later. And then you continue to move down the agenda until at the end of the day, you move to adjourn. And in North Dakota, we do not set times. In some other districts, they do. You simply move to adjourn. You vote on whether you want to adjourn. And then if it passes, meeting adjourned, everything's done. Research is the most important aspect of your congressional debate career. Now, research is going to be when you're finding out new ideas, finding out new arguments, forming your own stances and opinions on certain topics. Now, there are a bunch of sources you can get research from, and I would just recommend that you always stay conscientious of your source and you always cite your source, because if you cite Wikipedia, you will get torn apart into shreds. Now, there are some good sources to go through, whether going to NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, BBC. Those are all very good ones. If you want some more political opinions, you can go to some of the think tanks, like the Think Tank Directory for both Harvard Kennedy School and Columbia University are both very good sources to find some think tanks you can find. Also, there are some good ones you can look like the Brookings Institute, American Civil Liberties Union, American Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Heritage Foundations, the National Center for Policy Analysis, and the RAND Corporation are all very good think tanks that you can look at. Now, when you're looking at a think tank, always be sure to look at the About section, which is going to teach you or going to show you basically what their morals are. So you can see if they lean independent, conservative, Democratic, Republican, liberal. You can look at that and see what their moral compass is to better understand where they're coming from. And you might have to be prepared to defend some of that information. Another really good one is to look at some of the government websites, which will also help you on some relations or some research, especially on some of the ends of writing legislation or looking at legislation that might already be in place or is being looking to repeal. So the federal government portal is USA.gov. The Congressional Budget Office is CBO.gov. Then you can go to a very good source, which is the Congressional Research Service, which is oneusa.gov. And all these other ones are the Congressional Research Service, which is going to show you a ton of internal congressional research files and folders and portfolios about bills, legislations, constitutional amendments that you can find and then do more research on. So it's a very good jumping off point, especially if it's a bill that's already in place or is based off a bill already in place. A bill must have national jurisdiction, i.e., when passed into law, the federal government must have the authority to implement it. The bills enumerate the details of how a particular law must work, including when it will take effect, how much tax levy will be appropriated, and if applicable, and if how many infractions, violations will be dealt with. A bill may answer the who, what, when, where, and most specifically the how, but a bill does not have to and probably should not answer the why. Legislators will explain the rationale behind bills, speeches, and a solution, and the implementation can spark deeper, more meaningful debate. Students should also be mindful of how controversial an issue is. For example, is it likely that the students will argue against the bill to assist starving infants? Of course not. There needs to be two sides. Frequently, arguments over the bill stem from the amount of funding, since there are countless problems needing solutions. Funding projects often comes down to whether or not one item should be prioritized over another. Since the execution branch runs most of the agencies that enforces federal laws, understanding those helps. While foreign affairs are often fall under the jurisdiction of the executive branch, funding efforts such as USAID can have an impact on successes or failures of the United States involvement, in other countries especially, and therefore can be framed as a bill. See the research links that I posted before as good starting points. Writing an effective bill involves more time and research than researching ones by reading someone else. A student must ask her himself what the legislation does, who is involved, and how much time is needed for implementation. So all of these are going to be very useful on how to write bills. For more specific ability to write a bill, you need to look at the United States or the NSDA website on how to write constitutional bills and how to write constitutional amendments for better information on how to write some of these. But for the most part, that's simply the aspects you're looking for. A bill that can be enforced, a bill that answers how and where, but not necessarily why, because the congressional debaters will answer why. Next, we're going to talk about parliamentary motions. Parliamentary motions are the backbone of parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order, which is what, of course, our Congress is based off of. So I'm going to quickly talk about a couple of them that are very important. You can fix time for reassembling, adjourn, recess. Those three are all together. they essentially break the amount of time you have in the Congress. So to adjourn is to end the meeting, to recess is to break the meeting into a piece for a specific amount of time, and to fix time for reassembling is to arrange the time for the next meeting. The next one that's going to be important is to rise to a question of personal privilege. To rise to a question of personal privilege is the most important one you need to know. Because in Congress, you cannot say, I need to pee. So you need to be able to stand up, say, I rise to a point of personal privilege. They'll say, state that privilege to exit chambers so you can use the facilities, use Kleenexes, whatever you need to do. Or if it's something in the chamber, I rise to make a personal privilege, state that privilege to confer with Representative Domine, at which point you can go sit by him and talk to him. Or it can even be simple as, I rise to a point of personal privilege, state that privilege, I want to close the blinds because they're in my eyes. Basically, a personal privilege allows you to get out of your chair and do a specific task and then either return to your chair or stay in someone else's seat. The next part is going to be important is what's going to be calling for the orders of the day. Calling for the orders of the day is at the end of the Congress is going to be voting on any legislation that has not already been voted on. Basically, it's the prelude to an adjournment. It basically gets everything that's on the agenda off of it. The next thing is going to be appeal a decision of the chair, which is to reverse a decision of the chair. So if the chair makes a specific decision, you can appeal to the decision to make sure that the chair does not do something. Now, this is a very rare motion. You typically don't see it unless the presiding officer chooses to make a decision that no one likes. You can also call for a point of parliamentary procedure, which is to correct a point of parliamentary procedure or an error that was made on how things are run by either the presiding officer or the chair or even other members. You can also call what's called a division of the chamber, which is if you did a voice vote, which most leagues do not allow a voice vote anymore, but if you did, you can call for a division of the chamber, which is either a ballot vote to verify a voice vote or is a hand-raising vote or standing vote to verify a voice vote. You can also divide a motion, which means that you can separate it from its amendments. You can rescind, reconsider, and call for several other items taken from the table, lay on the table, and previous question. Those are all going to be to repeal decisions, add decisions, take items that are on the table, off the table, reset the agenda, basically all for a specific item. Now, obviously, you're going to have what's called the main motion. So the main motion is what's going to introduce business. To introduce business is to basically completely suggest new ways of what needs to be done. Main motions are also kind of rare, but they also technically count as introducing legislation. So you need to understand which table of parliamentary motions you need to understand. There is a beautiful table that you can print out from the NSDA website. And that is how you're going to be able to suggest motions to effectively run the chamber to your liking. Anyway, this has been the Dickinson High School Communication Arts YouTube channel, and we thank you for watching our video about how to properly congressionally debate to how you want to do.